I need to tell you what I saw in the archives beneath the Imperial Palace, what they made me catalogue, what I became in those 37 months before they decided I knew too much and sent me here to this detention level where the walls hum with a frequency that makes your teeth ache and your dreams bleed into waking. My name was Corvash 10, Senior Archival Technician, Imperial Records Authority, Sublevel Obsidian 9, Clearance Code Orek 7, 3 Besh, and I was responsible for the physical maintenance and digital transcription of the Emperor's personal collection of pre-Imperial documents, Sith artifacts, Force-sensitive testimonies, and what they called in the requisition forms, historical anomalies requiring perpetual classification. I was 26 when I took the posting. I'm 30 now. Though the woman who comes twice a day with the tray of nutritional supplement and water says I look 50, says my hair went white in streaks, says I talk in my sleep in a language she doesn't recognize. Though I know it's old Sith because I spent 16 hours a day reading it, transcribing it, touching the datapads and the actual parchment and the holocrons that would activate sometimes without prompting, filling my workspace with crimson geometric projections and voices that spoke in layers, multiple tones overlapping, saying things that made perfect sense in the moment and turned to ash in my memory afterwards. The job posting came through official channels, vetted by the ISB, triple encrypted, hand-delivered to my apartment in Coruscant's lower administrative sector by a man in a grey uniform with no rank insignia who waited while I read it and then watched me sign the non-disclosure agreement with a stylus that pricked my thumb, sealing the contract with a drop of blood absorbed into the datapad's surface. The salary was exceptional. The benefits included housing in the Palace Auxiliary Residential Wing, full medical, a personal food allocation above standard rations, and a notation that my family would receive an Imperial loyalty pension should I die in service. That last part should have warned me. It didn't. I was ambitious. I was educated University of Coruscant, dual degree in archival science and ancient languages, top 15% of my class. I was loyal. My father had served in the Clone Wars as a logistics coordinator. My mother worked in the Imperial Agricultural Planning Bureau. I believed in order. I believed in the Emperor's vision. I believed that the rebellion were terrorists and that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic and that the Empire represented humanity's best hope for galactic stability. The first 3 months were mundane. They gave me a workspace that was actually a vault, 20 meters by 30. Durasteel walls painted institutional grey, bright white overhead lighting that never dimmed, temperature controlled to exactly 18 degrees Celsius to preserve the documents. The smell was particular old paper, ozone from the stasis field generators, something chemical I couldn't identify, something organic underneath it all like dried herbs or very old incense. My supervisor was a woman named Uthara Wen, maybe 45, thin, severe, with the kind of posture that suggested military background. She wore the standard bureaucrat's uniform, dark grey with silver piping, and she gave me the orientation in a voice that never rose above a monotone. "You will arrive at 0600 hours, she said, walking me through the vault on that first day, her boots clicking on the polished floor. "You will scan your biometrics at the outer checkpoint, proceed through decontamination. Yes, it's necessary. Some of these materials are archaeologically sensitive and enter through the secondary access corridor. You will not speak to anyone you encounter in the corridors. You will not ask questions about other personnel. Your clearance grants you access to this vault and the refresher station on this level only. You will catalog and transcribe items according to the priority queue loaded into your workstation each morning. You will not remove any materials from the vault. You will not make personal copies. You will not discuss your work with anyone, including other Imperial personnel, unless they possess equivalent clearance and a need-to-know authorization. Violation of any protocol will result in immediate termination and legal consequences under Imperial Code 779, subsection 3. Do you understand?" I understood. I was eager. I spent the first week cataloging what seemed to be mundane Republic-era senatorial correspondence, beautifully preserved flimsiplast in archival sleeves, written in formal basic, discussing taxation policies and trade route disputes, and the political maneuvering that preceded the Clone Wars. Dull work, but I was meticulous. I logged every document, cross-referenced every name, flagged inconsistencies in dating or authorship. Uthara reviewed my work daily, said nothing, corrected nothing. I took that as approval. Week 2, they gave me my first Sith text. It was a fragment, really, maybe 20 pages of what Uthara called transliterated Old Sith, meaning someone centuries ago had converted the original angular glyphs into phonetic basic script. The content was a meditation technique, instructions for what it called reaching through the veil of false matter to touch the true current beneath. I transcribed it carefully, noting the repetitive structure, the almost hypnotic rhythm of the phrasing. When I finished, I felt tired in a strange way, not physically exhausted but mentally hollow, like I'd given something away without meaning to. I went back to my quarters that night and slept 14 hours, dreaming of red corridors that curved in ways that defied geometry, where every turn brought me back to the same junction with the same door that opened onto darkness. That was when the headaches started. Small ones at first, just pressure behind my eyes, the kind you get from staring at screens too long. I requested a medical appointment. The droid physician scanned me, found nothing, prescribed standard analgesics. The medication helped for a few days. Then the headaches came back. Sharper, accompanied by a sensation like someone pressing their thumb into the base of my skull. Month 2. The content shifted. More Sith texts, these ones partial translations from actual artifacts, with footnotes in Uthara's handwriting explaining gaps in the linguistic record. I learned Old Sith faster than I'd learned any language at university. It started to make intuitive sense. The way the glyphs connected, the grammatical structures that embedded power dynamics and emotional states directly into syntax. There were texts about ritual scarification, about binding spirits to objects, about consuming the life force of others to extend your own existence. There were diagrams of temples on worlds I'd never heard of: Korriban, Dromund Kaas, Malachor, Zeost. There were records of experiments conducted by Sith lords whose names were partially redacted, involving prisoners subjected to what the texts called alchemical reformation, which, as far as I could determine, meant they were transformed into something no longer human through a combination of the Force and biological manipulation. I asked Uthara once, carefully, why we were preserving these materials. She looked at me for a long time before answering. "The Emperor believes knowledge is power," she said. "Even knowledge of atrocity. Perhaps especially that. Would you rather these texts fall into the hands of rebel scholars who would use them as propaganda against us? Or would you prefer they remain classified, studied, understood by those wise enough to learn from history's darkest chapters without repeating them?" It made sense. It did. I went back to work. Month 3, they introduced me to the holocrons. Not Jedi holocrons, I learned later. Those were stored in a different facility entirely, one I would never see. These were Sith holocrons, pyramidal or irregular polyhedrons of dark crystal or metal, each one containing the recorded personality and knowledge of a Sith Lord dead for centuries or millennia. Uthara taught me the activation protocols, which involved placing your hand on specific facets in a particular sequence while maintaining what she called the correct mental state. "Think of something that makes you angry," she instructed, demonstrating with a small black pyramid that looked like obsidian. "Not irritation. True anger, betrayal, injustice, the feeling that the galaxy has denied you something you deserve." I thought about my brother, who died in a rebel bombing on Gorman. I thought about the unfairness of it, the randomness, the way the Holonet News barely mentioned it, while glorifying the rebel heroes who'd probably planned the attack. The holocron activated. A figure materialized above it, translucent red, humanoid but wrong in the proportions, with eyes that were just voids. "Another archivist," the figure said, its voice layered with static. "How many have there been? 20? 30? You all have the same fear scent." Uthara deactivated it quickly. "Don't engage in conversation," she said. "They're programmed to manipulate. Extract the information logs only. Use the transcription protocols I provided." But the holocrons weren't passive databases. They talked. They commented on my work. They asked questions about the Empire, about the Emperor, about whether I'd ever felt the Force moving through me. One of them, a dodecahedron of tarnished silver that claimed to contain the knowledge of someone called Darth Andedu, told me I had latent sensitivity, that my headaches were the beginning of unwanted awakening, that I should leave before I became too useful to release. I didn't tell Euthera. I was afraid it would go in my record. I was afraid they'd reconsider my clearance. I needed this job. The salary was supporting my mother after my father's pension got tied up in some bureaucratic review. I couldn't afford to lose it. Month 4 was when I started noticing the patterns. Certain names appeared across multiple documents separated by centuries. Not common names, not titles, but specific individuals whose activities spanned time periods that made no sense if they were mortal. One name appeared 17 times across 12 centuries of records. Darth Sidious. Always in the context of prophecy, of a grand design, of a chosen vessel who would bring about the death of the Jedi and the return of Sith rule. The earliest reference was in a text dated approximately 3,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. The most recent was a document from the late Republic period, a report by someone with the title Sithari Apprentice, detailing the infiltration of Coruscant's political infrastructure. I started cross-referencing. I stayed late, past the mandatory departure time, until Euthara appeared behind me without warning. She moved silently. I'd learned, or maybe I just stopped hearing footsteps after a while in that vault, and told me to go home. "You're developing an obsession," she said. "I've seen it before. The material encourages pattern recognition. It's designed to. The Sith embedded cognitive triggers into their writings. You're being influenced." "I'm just being thorough," I said. "Thorough is completing your assigned cue. This." She gestured at my workstation, where I had multiple texts open, comparative timelines displayed, lexical analysis, subroutines running, is compulsion, go home, rest. "That's an order." I went home. I couldn't sleep. The patterns followed me. I started seeing connections everywhere, in the architecture of the palace corridors, in the timing of shift rotations, in the way Euthara's instructions sometimes contained embedded phrases that echoed Sith grammatical structures. I told myself I was being paranoid. The isolation was getting to me. I needed social contact. I tried visiting the commissary during peak hours, sitting among other palace functionaries, but their conversations felt hollow, scripted, like everyone was performing normalcy while thinking about something else entirely. Month 5, they gave me access to the sealed archives, a sub-vault within the main vault, environmentally controlled even more strictly, requiring a secondary biometric scan and a rotating access code delivered to my datapad each morning. The materials here weren't historical. They were contemporary. Reports from ISB field agents investigating Force-sensitive individuals across the galaxy. Interrogation transcripts, medical files on children identified as potential Force users, detailing their processing through Imperial facilities. There were videos. I was required to catalog them, which meant I had to watch them. The first one showed a girl, maybe 8 years old, strapped to a medical table while a droid injected her with something that made her scream in a way that didn't sound human. The video was labeled Acolyte Candidate 773, Sensitivity, Suppression Trial 4, Failure, Terminated. There were hundreds of these videos. Not all were children. Some were adults, captured Jedi, former Padawans, people who'd hidden their abilities for years until some algorithm or informant exposed them. The interrogations were conducted by inquisitors, figures in dark armor, who asked questions in voices that bypassed hearing and spoke directly into your mind. I know because I could hear them through the recordings, feel them pressing against my thoughts even through the temporal distance of playback. I started making mistakes in my transcriptions, transposing words, writing Sith phrases into basic text without realizing. Euthara caught them during review, said nothing the first few times, then called me into her office, a small chamber adjacent to the vault, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. "You need to request psychological counseling," she said. "Not suggested." "Need. I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded wrong to me, too high, strained. "You're showing classic signs of mimetic contamination," she said. "The material is designed to corrupt. Prolonged exposure without proper mental conditioning creates vulnerabilities. The ISB provides counseling specifically for personnel in your position. It's confidential. It won't affect your record. I don't need counseling, I said. I just need better sleep. She studied me for a long moment. Your performance is still acceptable, she said finally. But I'm flagging you for mandatory monthly reviews. If your degradation continues, you'll be reassigned. Reassigned? That was the word they used instead of terminated. I'd learned that by then. No one left this position voluntarily. You were reassigned, which meant you disappeared. There were stories among the lower-level palace staff, whispered over meals, about custodial workers who'd seen too much, technicians who'd asked too many questions, all of them reassigned to facilities on the Outer Rim or deep space stations or, in one case, to a research position on Scarif that definitely didn't exist because Scarif was just a military installation with no civilian research personnel. Everyone knew that. I became more careful. I stopped staying late. I limited my cross-referencing. I took the sleeping medication the medical droid prescribed when I reported chronic insomnia. The medication helped, but it gave me dreams that felt more real than waking dreams of walking through endless corridors lit by red emergency lighting, following a sound like mechanical breathing that grew louder no matter which direction I turned, until I finally found the source in a chamber where a figure in black stood with his back to me, and when he turned around there was nothing inside the armor, just darkness that looked back at me with awareness. I woke from that dream with a nosebleed, blood all over my pillow, the taste of copper in my mouth. It was 3 a.m. I got up, washed my face, stood in front of the mirror in my quarters refresher, and barely recognized myself. The woman who brought my meals was right. My hair had gone gray at the temples. I had dark circles under my eyes that made me look sunken, skeletal. I'd lost weight. My hands shook. I looked like the pictures I'd seen in the medical files. The after images of force sensitivity suppression candidates who'd survived the trials but come out changed, diminished, haunted. Month 7 was when I found the Emperor's personal journals. Not all of them, those were kept somewhere even my clearance couldn't access, if they existed at all. But fragments, pages that had been removed and refiled, maybe by accident, maybe deliberately, scattered across different archival boxes with innocuous labels like Senate Procedural Records 32 BBY or Naboo Cultural Exchange Documents. I started finding them by accident, a page here, a page there, always in the same handwriting, elegant and precise, written in what I now recognized as High Sith, the formal register used for ritual and record keeping. I transcribed them compulsively, hiding the files in a personal directory I encrypted with codes I'd learned from the ISB security protocols documented in the vault. The content was fragmentary but coherent enough to assemble a narrative. The Emperor, though the journals predated that title, referred to him by another name, Palpatine, and before that Sidious, confirming what I'd suspected had been planning the Empire for decades. Not just planning, orchestrating, manufacturing crises, manipulating individuals, engineering the Clone Wars from both sides, playing the Republic Senate and the Separatist Council like instruments in a composition only he could hear fully. The journals described force techniques I'd never encountered in any other text, methods for clouding mass perception, for embedding compulsions into legislative language, for identifying and eliminating potential threats years before they could materialize. There were lists of names. Some I recognized from history: Jedi Masters who'd died in Order 66, senators who'd opposed the proclamation of the New Order and subsequently died in accidents. Some I didn't recognize but cross-referenced to other documents and found they were children, force-sensitive children whose families had been quietly eliminated, the children themselves taken to facilities for processing or experimentation. The journals described me, not by name, but by function. The archivists, one entry read, are necessary but temporary. They are conduits, processing the knowledge without understanding its full import, their minds shaped by proximity into useful configurations. When they break, and they always break, the organic mind is too fragile for prolonged contact with the unfiltered truth they are replaced. Their breakdown serves a purpose. It feeds the fear that maintains loyalty among others in the program. It reminds my servants that knowledge is dangerous, that some truths are reserved for those strong enough to bear them. I read that passage 20 times, trying to convince myself I'd mistranslated it, that High Sith was ambiguous and I'd imposed the wrong semantic layer. But I hadn't. The grammar was explicit. The vocabulary was precise. I was disposable. I'd always been disposable. The job wasn't archival work. It was a filtering process, using human minds to process and categorize material too dangerous for droids, whose programming might be compromised or hacked, and too voluminous for the Emperor to process personally. We were biological processors, and when we failed, when the material broke us, we were discarded, and new ones brought in. I should have stopped reading. I should have requested reassignment, invented a family emergency, fled to the Outer Rim, and hoped the Empire's reach didn't extend that far, though I knew it did. I should have done anything except what I actually did, which was continue. Because by then I couldn't stop. The compulsion Uthara had warned me about had metastasized into something beyond professional obsession. I needed to know. I needed to understand the pattern, the grand design, the architecture of the Empire's construction. It felt like standing at the base of an enormous statue, so large you can only see fragments at any given moment, and slowly, painstakingly mapping each piece until the full shape resolves, except this statue was made of suffering, built on foundations of murdered children and betrayed Jedi and manipulated populations. And its architect was still alive, still building, still adding to the design. Month 9. I started hearing whispers in the vault when I was alone. Not the holocrons. I'd learned to mute those, to extract their data without activating their interactive protocols. These were different. Environmental, like the walls were speaking. Or something behind the walls. Something that had soaked into the durasteel from prolonged proximity to the archived materials. The whispers spoke in Old Sith, in High Sith, in languages I didn't recognize, and occasionally in Basic. Always the same phrases repeating. The design is incomplete. The apprentice watches. The weapon turns inward. The father devours the son. I reported it to Uthara as potential audio equipment. Malfunction. She had technicians sweep the vault. They found nothing. She asked if I was hearing voices. I lied, said no. Said it was probably stress and fatigue distorting ambient noise. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Maybe because my work remained accurate, my cataloging thorough, my transcriptions clean. But the whispers continued, growing more frequent, more insistent. They started giving me information, directions, check the lower shelves, north wall, behind the Ziost collection. I did, found a datapad that wasn't in any catalog, containing surveillance footage from within the Imperial Palace, showing high-level meetings I had no clearance to witness. Open the Undead holocron during the 3rd hour. I did, and the holocron's avatar told me things about immortality techniques, about essence transfer, about how the Emperor had died and returned multiple times already, each time into a cloned body prepared in advance. That the figure in the throne room wasn't the original Palpatine at all, but maybe the 5th or 6th iteration, each one slightly more degraded, more monstrous, held together by dark side energies and technologies that blurred the line between life and machinery. I started documenting everything in my encrypted files. Not for any noble purpose. I wasn't planning to leak it to the rebellion or expose the truth or any such heroics. I did it because the act of documentation gave me the illusion of control. If I wrote it down, catalogued it, formatted it properly, maybe I could contain it, keep it from spilling into my mind completely. Month 11, Uthara stopped coming to review my work. A new supervisor appeared, a man who introduced himself only as Director Verin, tall and thin with grey skin that looked almost artificially pale, eyes that didn't blink at normal intervals. He conducted his reviews remotely, watching through security cameras, occasionally issuing instructions through the vault's intercom system in a voice that made my teeth ache. "You've been very productive, Technician 10, he said during one such review. "Your transcription accuracy is exceptional, 99.7%, the highest we've seen." "Thank you, Director," I said, keeping my eyes on my workstation. "The Emperor has taken notice of your work," he continued. "You may be called upon for special assignments in the coming months. Assignments that would require expanded clearance and closer proximity to the palace's inner levels." I should have felt honored. Instead, I felt cold. The kind of cold that starts in your chest and spreads outward until your fingers and toes go numb. Closer proximity to the inner levels meant closer proximity to him, to the Emperor, and I had read enough by then to know what happened to people in his presence. The journals described it clinically how Force-sensitive individuals experienced his aura as crushing pressure, how even non-sensitives reported disorientation, fear, the sensation of being observed by something vast and predatory, how those who served him most closely, who entered his sanctum regularly, developed a particular look, hollowed out, as if something essential had been scooped away, leaving only function. "I'm honored, Director," I said, the lie smooth because I'd gotten very good at lying by then. "You should be," he said. "Few are granted such trust." He disappeared from the screen. I sat in the silence of the vault, surrounded by millennia of Sith knowledge, and understood with perfect clarity that I was being promoted into my own execution. Whatever special assignment they had planned, it would be the last thing I did. Either I'd see something I couldn't be allowed to remember, or I'd be used in some ritual or experiment, or I'd simply know too much and be disappeared quietly, another archivist who broke under the strain of prolonged exposure to the unfiltered truth. I had maybe weeks, maybe days. I started preparing. Not escape security was too thorough, and my biometric data was everywhere, my movements tracked constantly. But preservation. I compiled everything I'd learned, everything I'd transcribed and documented and pieced together into a single compressed file. I formatted it as historical fiction, a creative work, claiming authorship and copyright under my own name, embedding it with metadata that would make it look like a personal project unrelated to my official duties. I uploaded it to 3 separate data havens using anonymous protocols I'd learned from archived ISB encryption manuals, setting delayed release triggers tied to my biometric status. If my heartbeat flatlined for more than 6 hours, or my brainwave patterns dropped below consciousness thresholds for more than 48 hours, the files would release automatically to randomized holonet nodes, distributing across the network in a pattern designed to evade Imperial monitoring. I didn't know if it would work. Probably not. The Empire's surveillance was comprehensive, their data scrubbing algorithms sophisticated. But it gave me something, a small defiance, a refusal to simply disappear without trace. Month 12, the summons came. Not from Verin, from someone whose name wasn't given, delivered by a pair of Imperial guards, the crimson-armored sentinels who served the Emperor personally, their faces invisible behind reflective visors. They escorted me from the vault without explanation, up through levels I'd never accessed, through corridors where the grey durasteel gave way to black polished stone, where the lighting shifted from white fluorescent to a dim red glow that pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Or maybe my heartbeat matched it. Other functionaries we passed didn't look at us. They kept their eyes down, their movements quick and purposeful, radiating the particular fear of people who knew they were in a predator's territory. We reached a door that looked like solid obsidian, no visible controls or access panel. The guards stopped. The door opened anyway, sliding sideways with a sound like stone grinding on stone. Beyond was a chamber that defied the palace's usual aesthetic. No imperial sterility here, just organic darkness, a vast space where the walls curved upward into shadows, the dim lighting couldn't penetrate, where the floor was engraved with symbols I recognized from the oldest Sith texts, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly because they seemed to move, to shift configuration based on viewing angle or mental state. At the center of the chamber, on a raised dais, sat a throne that looked grown rather than built, like it had accreted from some dark, crystalline substance over centuries. And on the throne sat the Emperor. I'd seen holo images, of course. Everyone had. The official portraits showing a dignified elderly statesman, the holovid broadcasts where he addressed the Senate or the galaxy, his voice measured and reassuring. None of that prepared me for the physical presence. He was small, shrunken, his robes too large for his frame, his face deeply lined and somehow unfinished, like a sculpture abandoned mid-creation. But the presence, what I'd learned to recognize as Force presence, the way space bent around certain individuals, was overwhelming. It pressed down on me, made breathing difficult, filled my head with a sound like distant screaming, thousands of voices overlapping in agony or ecstasy, impossible to distinguish which. "Corvash 10, he said, and his voice was wrong, layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison, slightly out of sync. "You have served well." I couldn't respond. My throat had closed. I managed a nod, a bow, dropping to one knee because that seemed appropriate, because I needed to look away from his face, which kept shifting in my peripheral vision, becoming younger, older, different features entirely, as if I was seeing multiple versions superimposed. "Rise," he said, and I did, my legs shaking. "You have questions, that is natural. The knowledge you have processed, the patterns you have identified, these would breed curiosity in any intelligent mind. Ask." It was a trap. It had to be. But I couldn't not ask, couldn't waste this opportunity, even if it killed me, which it probably would. "The journals," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The ones labeled as Palpatine's. They describe a design spanning centuries, multiple lifetimes." How is it possible?" he interrupted, a smile playing at his lips, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. "You have read the texts on essence transfer, on the preservation of consciousness beyond death. You are an intelligent woman, Technician 10. Surely you can extrapolate." "You've been multiple people," I said. "Multiple bodies. The same consciousness, perpetually transferred." "Not quite," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Transfer implies movement from one vessel to another, a simple relocation. What I have achieved is more elegant. I am all of them, simultaneously. Every version that has existed, every iteration, all present in this moment, this flesh, the bodies die, the power accumulates. I am not merely Palpatine, not merely Sidious, not merely any single identity you might name. I am the culmination, the synthesis, the grand design made manifest." The room felt like it was tilting. I pressed my hand against my temple, trying to stop the pressure building there, the sensation of something pushing into my skull from the inside. "You feel it," he said, sounding pleased. "The awakening. Your exposure to the archives was not accidental, Technician 10. You were selected, tested, shaped. Few possess the mental resilience to process the volume of material you have catalogued without complete psychological collapse. Fewer still emerge with enhanced sensitivity, the latent potential activated by proximity to concentrated dark side energies. You are ready for the next stage." "What stage?" I asked, though I didn't want to know, didn't want to hear the answer. "Integration," he said. "You have become a vessel for the knowledge you have processed, a living archive. That knowledge must be preserved, refined, made accessible. You will undergo a procedure that will enhance your connection to the Force, stabilize your deteriorating mental state, and transform you into something far more useful than a simple technician. You will become an adept, a keeper of secrets, a living extension of the Empire's memory." The procedure. I'd seen records of those, the videos I'd catalogued, the screaming children and broken adults, the successors who emerged as hollow-eyed servants with no will beyond serving their master's commands. The failures who died on the tables or lived on as things that weren't quite alive, sustained by machinery and dark side energies, their consciousness fragmented and dispersed. "And if I refuse?" I asked, knowing the answer. His smile widened. "Refusal is impossible. You have no will that is not mine. You surrendered it month by month, document by document, as the knowledge I had you process rewrote your neural pathways, created dependencies, bound you to patterns of thought that originate with me. You believe you are asking questions of your own volition. You are not. You are following a script I embedded in the very materials you studied, each text containing subtle compulsions that accumulated over time, shaping your responses, your fears, your choices, until you arrived precisely here, precisely now, ready to serve your ultimate purpose. I wanted to deny it, to assert my autonomy, my independence, but as I reached for defiance, I found nothing there, just hollow space where my will should have been, and beneath it a framework of commands and compulsions I'd never noticed integrating, so subtle and gradual that they'd become indistinguishable from my own thoughts. The realization broke something in me. I felt it crack, whatever core element of identity that had survived the year of archival work, the slow erosion of self through prolonged contact with knowledge designed to corrupt. I opened my mouth to scream, and no sound came out. Excellent, the Emperor said. You are ready. Take her to sub-level theta. Prepare the conversion chamber. The guards moved forward. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond to my commands, only to his, and his will was for me to stand still, to accept, to surrender completely. They took me by the arms, their grip cold, even through the armor, mechanical, inhuman, and dragged me from the throne room, back into the corridors, down this time, elevators descending through levels that weren't on any map I'd ever seen, past doorways that opened onto chambers filled with machinery that looked biological, pulsing and wet, past rooms where figures floated in translucent tanks, their bodies distorted, mutated, covered in growths that might have been tumors or technological implants, or something that blurred the distinction between the two. They brought me to a chamber that was all white tile and stainless steel, clinical and sterile, with a medical table at its center, equipped with restraints, and surrounded by equipment I didn't recognize, columns of dark crystal connected to banks of monitors, injection arrays, devices that hummed with energy that made my skin crawl. A medical droid waited, its photoreceptors glowing red, its manipulator arms tipped with instruments designed for cutting, injecting, modifying. Behind it stood a figure in black robes, face hidden beneath a deep hood, hands clasped in front, perfectly still. The guards secured me to the table. I struggled, but the restraints were designed for force users, lined with cortosis alloy that disrupted force energies and prevented escape through any means, physical or otherwise. The robed figure approached, leaning over me, and I could feel its regard even without seeing its face. A cold evaluation, a calculation of value and use. She is highly integrated, the figure said, its voice feminine, modulated through some kind of vocoder. The Emperor's conditioning has progressed further than anticipated. Conversion probability is favorable. Estimated retention of core personality, 37%. Estimated functional lifespan post-procedure, 8 to 12 years before deterioration, requires essence harvesting. Essence harvesting. I'd read about that. The process of extracting a person's knowledge and consciousness and storing it in holocrons or transferring it to new vessels. What remained after extraction wasn't alive in any meaningful sense, a biological shell, capable of basic functions but devoid of will, personality, anything that made a person a person. Begin, the figure said, stepping back. The droid moved forward, its manipulator arms extending. I felt the first injection, cold spreading through my veins, something chemical that made my vision blur and my hearing distort. All sounds becoming echoes, layered and distorted. Then came the second injection, this one hot, burning, racing through my bloodstream like fire, igniting nerve clusters, forcing my body into convulsions against the restraints. The monitors chirped and displayed data I couldn't interpret through the pain. The overwhelming sensation of being unmade, broken down into component parts and reassembled according to some template that wasn't mine, wasn't human. I don't know how long it lasted. Time became meaningless. A continuous present of agony and transformation, of feeling my mind expand beyond the confines of my skull and then compress again, squeezed into new configurations, new patterns of thought that weren't mine but were becoming mine, replacing what I had been with what I was being made into. I saw things that weren't there, other versions of myself, other paths I could have taken, all converging on this moment, this table, this transformation. I saw the Emperor's design not as abstract knowledge but as living reality, the vast web of causation and manipulation he had woven across decades, and I was one thread among thousands, significant only in how I connected to other threads, how my function served the greater pattern. I saw my own future. Decades spent in the deep archives, no longer cataloging but becoming the catalog, a living database accessible only to the Emperor and his most trusted servants. My consciousness spread across multiple substrates, organic, mechanical, digital, so that if one failed, others would preserve the knowledge I contained. I saw myself aging rapidly, the procedure's side effects accelerating cellular degradation, saw myself at 40 looking 70, at 50 barely human. Sustained by machinery and dark side energies, my mind fragmented into partitions that no longer communicated coherently. I saw my eventual death, not peaceful but harvested, my consciousness extracted and stored, while my body was recycled into raw material for some other project, nothing wasted in the Empire's efficient cruelty. And I saw the alternative. The path I'd tried to prepare, the files I'd uploaded, their delayed release triggers activated by my transformation, by the fundamental change in my biometric signature that the system would interpret as death. I saw them propagating across the holonet, distributed and replicated, too many copies to suppress completely, reaching people who would read them and understand, even if only partially, the nature of what they served. Not enough to change anything. The Empire was too entrenched, too powerful, the Emperor's design too comprehensive, but enough to plant seeds of doubt, small corruptions in the certainty that kept the system functioning. The Emperor knew. I could feel his awareness, his amusement at my small defiance, his confidence that it would amount to nothing, that even this act of resistance served his purposes somehow, fed the narrative of heroic rebellion crushed by inevitable imperial order. But he allowed it anyway, perhaps because the game was boring without opposition, perhaps because even he, with all his accumulated power and knowledge, needed to believe there was still something to struggle against, some force that might theoretically threaten his supremacy, or else, what was the point of all this accumulation, all this control? The procedure ended. The droid withdrew its instruments. The pain faded, replaced by numbness, then by a cold clarity that felt wrong, artificial, like I was experiencing existence through filters that rendered everything in schematic simplicity. I could still think, still recognize myself as Corvash 10, but it felt distant, a label applied to a function rather than a lived identity. The restraints released. I sat up, moved my limbs, felt the wrongness in how I moved, too precise, too controlled, like someone else was operating my body remotely and I was just observing. The robed figure approached again, removing its hood, revealing a woman's face, middle-aged, scarred along one side, with eyes that were clouded white but somehow still saw. "Welcome to the Order of Archival Adepts," she said. "You are now Keeper 17. Your predecessor served for 9 years before deterioration required her retirement. You will serve until you are no longer functional, at which point your essence will be harvested and your position filled. Do you understand your purpose?" "Yes," I heard myself say, the word automatic, no thought required. I understood completely. I was a tool, a biological database, a living extension of the Empire's vast machinery of documentation and control. I would spend the remainder of my existence processing information, storing it, making it accessible to those authorized to access me. I would have no life beyond this function, no desires except those implanted to ensure my continued operation, no hope except the hope that my service would be sufficient to delay the inevitable harvesting. And beneath that artificial clarity, buried but not gone, the part of me that was still Corvash 10 screamed and screamed and screamed, a sound no one would hear because it never reached my throat, trapped forever in the prison of my own transformed mind. They took me to my new quarters, which weren't quarters at all but a cell, 2 meters by 3, containing a sleep pod, a waste reclamation unit, a food dispenser, and nothing else. No windows, no decorations, no indication of where in the palace I was or how to leave. Not that I would try. The compulsions they'd implanted were comprehensive. I couldn't even conceive of escape. Could only feel a vague wrongness when the thought approached. Like trying to imagine a color outside the visible spectrum. My new routine began immediately. 14 hours a day in a chamber similar to the vault I'd worked in before, but larger, colder, filled with equipment I'd never seen, machines that interfaced directly with my nervous system, downloading information, uploading queries, using my brain as a processing substrate for problems too complex or sensitive for standard computers. Other adepts worked in adjacent chambers, visible through transparent steel walls, all of us connected to the same network, our thoughts occasionally bleeding into each other's, fragments of their minds mixing with mine, until I sometimes couldn't remember if a particular piece of knowledge was something I'd learned or something another keeper had processed and I'd absorbed through our forced connection. I don't know how long I've been here. Time functions differently for adepts. We experience it in compressed bursts during active processing and extended voids during dormancy. Our consciousness powered down to conserve energy, our bodies sustained by automated systems that regulate every biological function to optimize our utility. I think it's been months. It might have been years. My body has aged. I caught a reflection once in a polished surface and barely recognized the woman staring back, gaunt and pale with hair gone completely white and eyes that were developing the clouded look I'd seen in my trainer, the visible marker of adepts who'd been in service too long. The files I uploaded, I sometimes catch fragments of information about them, processing requests from ISB agents investigating malicious historical fiction circulating on fringe holonet nodes, reports on individuals arrested for possessing or distributing seditious propaganda. The Empire is suppressing them, of course, but the suppression is incomplete, proving the Emperor was right. Even this defiance serves his purposes, providing justification for greater control, stricter information regulation, enhanced surveillance. Nothing escapes the design. Every act of resistance becomes a tool for tighter oppression. I'm writing this during a moment of lucidity, a gap in the processing schedule when my consciousness is my own, relatively speaking. I don't know if anyone will ever read it. I don't know if the compulsions will let me finish, or if the monitoring systems will detect this unauthorized use of cognitive resources and trigger a disciplinary response. But I need to document this, need to leave some record of what I was before I became what I am, some testimony to the process of transformation, the machinery of imperial control. If you're reading this, whoever you are, know that the Empire is not merely a political structure or a military force. It's a mechanism for consuming people, processing them into components of a vast machine that serves a single malevolent intelligence at its core. The Emperor is not a man, not anymore, perhaps never was. He is appetite incarnate, power accumulating power, knowledge consuming knowledge, a black hole of will that bends everything toward itself, until nothing exists except service to his design. Resist if you can. Flee if you can't resist. Don't believe that your intelligence or education or loyalty will protect you. Those are the very qualities that make you useful, that mark you as a candidate for integration. The most useful tools are those that think they're people, that believe they're making choices, right until the moment they realize every choice they made was scripted from the beginning. I thought I was cataloging history. I was becoming it, one document at a time, one compulsion at a time, until there was no boundary between the knowledge and myself, until I was just another text in the archive, another piece of evidence testifying to the Empire's absolute power over those who serve it. The alarm is sounding. They've detected this unauthorized activity. Someone is coming to terminate this session, to possibly terminate me if the disciplinary review determines I've become unreliable. I'm glad. I hope they harvest me today, right now, before I lose any more of what I was. I hope the extraction fails, and I die rather than persist in partial form. Fragmented across storage media, consciousness without body or will, an eternal witness to atrocities I'm compelled to document but powerless to prevent. I hope the woman who brings my meals was right, that I look old beyond my years, because maybe that means the degradation is accelerating, that I have months instead of years before functional failure makes me worthless for anything except harvesting. I hope the seeds I planted in those released files germinate somewhere, in someone, and even if they don't topple the Empire or save anyone, they at least ensure that this testimony exists in some form beyond my deteriorating memory. My name was Corvash 10. I was 26 years old when I took a job cataloging documents in the Imperial Palace. I believed in order and loyalty and the Emperor's vision for galactic peace. I was wrong. I am now Keeper 17, Archival Adept, Imperial Records Authority, Sub-Level Theta, and I am not alive in any way that matters, just a function executing its programming, a biological processor optimized for information storage and retrieval, property of the Empire, scheduled for eventual harvesting when my utility declines. But some part of me remains, buried beneath the conditioning and the compulsions and the invasive procedures, and that part is screaming this message to anyone who might hear it across whatever distance of time or space separates us. The Empire's power is absolute only because we believe it is, because we accept that resistance is futile, that compliance is survival. But there are fates worse than death, transformations more complete than execution, and the Empire specializes in those, in erasing people while keeping their bodies functional, in extracting everything useful and discarding what remains. Don't end up like me. Don't believe their promises. Don't think your value will protect you. Everyone is eventually processed, one way or another, turned into component parts of the machine. The only victory available is to remain yourself until the end, to preserve some kernel of identity they can't access or corrupt or repurpose. Some final defiance, even if it's only internal, invisible, known only to you in your last conscious moment before the darkness comes. I failed at that. I let them take everything. This confession is all that remains, and even this is probably part of the design, another data point in their vast archive of how people break and what remains after breaking. Information they'll use to refine their techniques on whoever comes after me. The door is opening. They're here. The guards and the droid and probably the robed woman who welcomed me to this order of living corpses. I can feel the compulsions activating, shutting down my rebellion, my fear, everything except compliance. My hands are moving without my input, deleting this document, erasing the evidence of unauthorized activity, preparing to accept whatever punishment or adjustment they've deemed necessary. But before it disappears completely, before I lose the capacity to resist even this much, I'm embedding it in the network, fragmenting it across multiple substrate memories, encoding it as innocuous data that might survive the coming purge, might reassemble itself someday when accessed by the right query, might reach someone who needs to know what happens to people who serve the Empire too well. Remember my name. Remember what I was. Remember that the archive preserves everything, including its own crimes, and somewhere in the vast data networks of Imperial control, this testimony persists, waiting to be discovered, waiting to testify. They're here. The syringe is coming. I can see the droid's manipulator arm extending, the needle glinting in the white overhead lights. I can feel the coldness of the injection spreading through my veins, the shutdown protocols activating, my consciousness fragmenting and dispersing across the network, no longer centralized in this failing body, but distributed, diffuse, everywhere and nowhere. I'm still screaming. I'll always be screaming. But the sound is data now, information without voice, archived in the very systems that destroyed me. This is what power looks like from the inside. This is what the Empire does to those who serve it faithfully. This is how I died while remaining alive, useful to the end and beyond. This is how the design perpetuates itself, consuming its own servants to fuel its continuation. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is all that remains of Corvash 10, who believed in order and loyalty and the greater good, and learned too late that those beliefs were tools used to dismantle her piece by piece, until nothing remained but function, servitude, and the terrible clarity of understanding exactly what she had become. Remember, resist, run, or end up like me, property of the Emperor, archived and processed and stored, consciousness spread across machines and biological substrates and dark side reliquaries, eternal and powerless, witnessing everything and capable of changing nothing, a warning no one will heed because by the time you understand you need to heed it, you're already too integrated to escape, already part of the design, already consumed. The injection is complete. I'm fading. The last thing I see is my own face reflected in the droid's polished chassis, and I'm smiling because the compulsions make me smile, make me grateful for the adjustment, eager to return to service, purged of doubt and defiance. But underneath that smile, in the final millisecond before consciousness disperses completely, I feel it, the last ember of Corvash 10. The part they couldn't quite extinguish, burning with pointless fury at the injustice of it all, the casual cruelty, the industrial-scale processing of human beings into imperial resources. That ember goes into the archive too. Everything does. The Empire preserves its crimes meticulously, confident that preservation is not the same as accountability, that documentation without consequence is just another form of power. They're right. But someday, maybe, someone will access these archived screams and understand what they mean, will piece together the testimonies of all the people like me who were processed and filed and stored, will see the pattern that reveals the true nature of imperial power. And maybe that understanding will matter, or maybe it won't. Either way, this is my last act of witness, my final testimony. I existed. I mattered. I was a person before they made me a thing. And somewhere in the data networks of the Empire, this truth persists, indelible and damning, waiting to be found. Waiting. Always waiting. Forever.